Good day, I'm Vincent Saxtetter, and this is the After the Age of Fire channel. This is episode 24, recorded January 3rd, 2026. The title of this episode is How Plants Harvest Sunlight. Um, to recap what this channel is about, this is a prepping channel, but it's not your average prepping channel. I'm uh, discussing what the human race has been doing over the last 250 years. So we've been doubling our consumption every 22 years or so. So every generation has twice as much as the previous generation on average. Um, and we're we're coming to the end of that sometime around now, give or take 20 or 30 years. I'll be discussing what that transition looks like between being able to multiply our consumption of energy and everything else repeatedly to no longer having that ability to grow, to multiply year on year. Um, and then uh, I'm also discussing how much energy we're likely to have after we come to the end of this, and whether we'll have the current amount, which is about 46,000 calories per person per day worldwide, averaging across the world, and another 15,000 of food, fodder, and wood, calories embodied in food, fodder, and wood. And so the question is, after we come to the end of our growth, will we maintain the level of consumption we have now, or maybe a bit more, or will we decrease? Will we find that we just can't sustain the amount of energy that we're consuming now and other resources? And the answer is we won't be able to sustain it. We'll have less energy and other resources on hand per person than we do now. Still a lot more than we used to, but maybe something like 15,000 calories of coal, oil, and gas, and renewables, and whatever else you want to throw at it, as opposed to the current 46,000. Um, So what am I prepping for? What am I trying to help you prep for? I'm trying to prep you for the transition and for living a prosperous and happy life as we go through that transition, and when we're in the new world where we're no longer growing exponentially as a human race, but instead we're finding a new way to live, uh, hopefully prosperously, with a bit less energy. And a bit less of other resources. And in particular, I'll be talking about how to prepare your family line. This transition is not going to happen overnight. We've been through 250 years of this growth. The transition itself may be already started, and it's something will happen over maybe 50 years. And then, in other words, the end of exponential growth. And then the transition down to a lower energy consumption will take a bit more time. So all of this will take a century or two to play out. So how do you prep yourself to live through that well, but also how do you prepare your family to thrive and to find opportunities to thrive and to prosper in the new age that's coming? Or another alternative is just to let things go as they are, and then my guess is most likely the way that many families are today, just not having many children. Your family line may not continue, and the human race will belong to other people besides you. So I assume that you're interested in a prospering, continuing family, and that's kind of what I'm trying to prep you for, to have a family that grows and that thrives even as we go through this transition. So where are we now? We're discussing where are we now in this channel. This is a sequence of content that will go on for at least 100 episodes, I think. Right now we're on episode 24, and as we begin the new year, and may I take this moment to wish you all a happy and thriving new year, and all the people around you in peace. I wish you all peace. So where we are now is we're in the first of three sections. We're talking about the exponential growth and about our energy, how much we consume and how much we're likely to be able to consume long term. And right now, we've already gone through coal, oil, and gas, and the future of coal, oil, and gas, and we've gone through the renewables in a lot of detail. And now we're going through the last sort of energy. It's energy from growing plants, food, fodder, and wood. And we began this examination of these options with episode 22, which is looking at how the world's plants adjust to the land that they grow on, and they lose about a factor of 5. Out of 5 calories coming from the sun, 4 out of 5 are lost simply because the world's average land is not the world's best land. We can tell because we grow things on the best land, and we see that we get 5 times as much from the best land as from average land. Then there's also another energy loss because plants grow and die, and they have their life cycle because there are seasons, because there are other rhythms, and because they have to live on real land instead of laboratories. The way that we can tell about this energy loss is because we take plants growing on the world's best land and we compare them to plants growing in our laboratories under intensive care being force-fed, and we see that the plants under intensive care in labs grow 3 times better. And lastly, there's a factor of 20 energy loss, which I'm getting into in this episode, and I'll follow up in the next episode, that happens inside of plants. It's not what's external to the plant, it's internal to the plant, a factor of 20 energy loss. So 1 out of 20 calories gets coming into, even in the world's best labs, only 1 out of 20 incoming sunlight calories will get harvested. And that's what I'm discussing today. And in the next episode, today's episode is how plants harvest sunlight. And the next episode will be drilling down into one particular part of that, which is in order to create plant material, plants don't just need sunlight, they also need something from the air called carbon dioxide, and they go to an immense amount of effort and use an immense amount of water in order to get that carbon dioxide. So I'll be discussing in the next episode why it's so hard to get carbon dioxide, why it's so necessary. Well, I'll also already spell out why it's necessary in this episode, but I'll be talking about what they do to get it, why it's so hard, and all the magic that they do. It's really the centerpiece of photosynthesis. Both this episode and the next episode are on harvesting sunlight, in other words, photosynthesis. But the centerpiece of it is the part where the plants, it isn't when they get the sunlight. The centerpiece is when they get the carbon dioxide, and that'll be the next episode. And the amount of water that they require is just immense. For every kilo of plant material, dry plant material that a plant grows, it needs around 600 kilos of water. They just go through water like you wouldn't believe. That's what we're up to. Now with that, I'll get into this current episode, which is how do plants harvest sunlight. So the format of this episode is where do plants harvest sunlight, and then what are the ingredients and the products. In other words, what is this process that we call photosynthesis? It turns out it has a very there's no arguing, there's no fudging around what photosynthesis is exactly. It has exactly a certain set of inputs and exactly another set of outputs, and so I'll spell those out. It's pretty simple, but it's a distinct recipe. You can't argue with it. And then I'll go into how plants do it, and it's roughly a 3-act play. So 3 acts, and I'll describe what the acts are, how they work. And then once we have the 3 acts, then we can talk about the energy losses that happen inside of a plant. In other words, overall there's this factor of 20 energy loss. Only 1 out of 20 sunlight calories gets harvested and turned into plant material. And I'll be discussing what is that factor of 20 and how that breaks down into different things inside the plant. And then lastly, that'll allow us to get to talking about what is the possibility for improving on that factor of 20. How could we, if we could somehow improve plants, how much better could they do than 1 out of 20? Um, Maybe by breeding, or maybe by genetic engineering, one or the other. How good could we get? And it turns out that there's a very stringent limit. We'll never get better than 1 out of 10, even in a magically perfect world. It'll even 1 out of 10 would be very, very hard, but that's, the fact that it's just impossible to get better than that. Literally impossible. So first, where is light harvested? So you almost certainly know that cells are not just blobs, they have organs. And it's not just the nucleus, they have many other organs inside them. A standard biology textbook picture of a cell will show 10 or 20 different organs inside of the cell. These are called organelles. Mitochondria might be one that you've heard of, but in particular, certain cells within plants, the ones that are responsible for harvesting sunlight, in other words, the green cells, they have organelles that are dedicated to harvesting light. And these organelles are called chloroplasts. And I'm not going to discuss chloroplasts themselves, have all sorts of structures within them, things that look like sci-fi skyscrapers, networks tying them together, and then within the floors of the skyscrapers yet other things. And I'm just not going to go there, but I think it's, if you want to spend a day of wonder, go and read about that. Really wonder. But even within the individual compartments within a chloroplast, there's yet more. There are these molecules that you may have heard of, things called proteins. You know that you eat proteins. Proteins are in reality chemicals, and they're chemicals with thousands or even 50,000 or more atoms in them. They're really, on atomic standards, immense things. And I want to say that just understanding what a protein does is really, really hard. And I'm not going to belabor this through the rest of this episode or the next ones very much, but I think you ought to know that even a small chemical, one with 5 or 10 atoms, or even sometimes 3 or 4, is really mysterious to us, and it's not because it's so small. Okay, it's not just because we never got around to seeing them until 100 or 200 years ago, maybe 100 years ago. It's not that they're new to us. It's that the way that they work makes them really, really complicated. Even something very small is extremely complicated. The reason, basically, it comes down. So I'll throw out a big word for you. It's quantum mechanics. It means that you can have just quantum mechanics is the rules for how electrons and atoms and individual atoms, individual electrons, how they move around each other, where they go and when they come, and so on. It's the forces on them and so on. And what quantum mechanics says is that basically an electron or a proton can be and is in many, many places all at the same time. And so you can have a molecule with, say, 4 atoms and 10 electrons, and because the electrons are not in a single place at a single time, they can do all sorts of tricks. They can dance around each other, tie knots around each other, and fill up large spaces with these knots and these paths. And and you get already with a material with 10 or 20 electrons can be so hard that even our best supercomputers uh, really are stumped by them. Just a few atoms. Um, so um, it's really it gets really out of hand really quickly. The rules of quantum mechanics and how they describe what's happening even in a small molecule. And what I'm trying to come to is that even a, a fairly small molecule, a few dozen atoms, is more out of reach for our understanding than the most complicated thing that we've ever built. Um, Even more complicated than a supercomputer. We can easily create a chemical with 10 or 20 atoms that stumps us in a way that our most complicated machines never will. Um, there's just no comparison. And then that's for a fairly small molecule. And I should mention that I should know about this because much of my career I've spent studying how to calculate the movements of electrons inside of various chemicals. I work on something called ab initio um, computation of materials, and solving the equations of quantum mechanics, and I know quite a bit about how to use supercomputers to calculate the properties of materials. So I should know, and I know that even simple materials can easily stump us and do stump us all the time. Then you take a protein, which might have 50,000 atoms in it, or a part of a protein like chlorophyll, which has thousands of atoms in it, and it takes it to a whole new level. There's an incomparable difference between a small molecule with 10 or 20 and another with 50,000 atoms, and these proteins are what our cells are made out of, and what do the photosynthesis inside of a plant. So we can get a rough idea of what these different proteins do and how they work, but it's something that we have to really struggle to even get to that. And I'll be giving you and so don't think that in the next content that I'll be giving you a full understanding of these things. I'm just giving you a bird's eye view of a bird's eye view. But it's enough to allow us to do some reasoning about energy flow and water use inside of a plant and figure out how much we could possibly ever improve the energy harvest from our plants. So that's where I just went over where the light is harvested. It's in chloroplasts, organs within a cell. It's done by different proteins, and there are lots of them. It's not like there's just one protein that's responsible. There are many. There are armies of proteins working together. Now, what is the plant? What is photosynthesis? That's the next question, and it's a very simple definition. The inputs for photosynthesis are, this is what the plant breathes in. It breathes in carbon dioxide. It needs one carbon dioxide molecule, and it needs 2 water molecules, and it needs 8 photons. Maybe I should go into what a photon is. You probably already know that light comes in packets. It cannot be reduced to packets smaller than this. Each packet is called a photon, and so when the light that you see coming into your eye is many of these packets coming in, and somehow they blend together to create the shapes and colors that you see. But what's really happening to your eye is is billions upon billions of these light packets flowing into your eye, streaming into your eye. And then your eye reacts to that and you see something. Okay, so the inputs to photosynthesis are 1 carbon dioxide molecule, 2 water molecules, and 8 photons. And they basically have to be visible light, the kinds of light that you can see. Otherwise, plants won't harvest anything from them. In the outputs of photosynthesis, what plants, first of all, they breathe out oxygen, and another output is, so oxygen is two, actually it's 2 oxygen atoms bound together in an oxygen molecule. That's what the air is filled with. It's filled with O2, 2 oxygens bound together in a molecule. And it also, the plant produces during photosynthesis 1 water molecule. And then the really important thing, well, another very important thing, that the energy bearing part that it produces is something called carbohydrate. And the chemical formula for carbohydrate is 1 carbon, 2 hydrogens, and 1 oxygen. So you break this down, coming in, there's 1 carbon atom in the carbon dioxide. There's 4 oxygen atoms, 2 in the carbon dioxide and 2 in the water. And there's 4 hydrogen atoms in the water. Going out, there's the same number of atoms. There's 1 carbon in the carbohydrate. There's 4 hydrogens, 2 in the carbohydrate and 2 in the water. And there are 4 oxygens, 1 in the water, 1 in the carbohydrate, and 2 in the oxygen. So the number of oxygens, hydrogens, and carbons hasn't changed. Okay, what has changed is that where you first had carbon dioxide, that carbon dioxide, it had carbon and 2 oxygens, and you've turned it in, and it's a gas at room temperature, and you've taken away one of the oxygens and put in instead 2 hydrogens, and then it's carbohydrate, which is a solid at room temperature, and it's the building block of sugars. So carbohydrate, I'm not talking about carbohydrates in the general term, where anything that you eat in your bread or your potatoes or something you call carbohydrate. I'm talking about in a very specific term. This carbohydrate molecule is 1 carbon, 2 hydrogens, and 1 oxygen. And it's a building block that you use to make the things that we generally call carbohydrates. For instance, 6 carbohydrates strung together can make 1 fructose molecule, that's fruit sugar, or 1 glucose molecule, or 12 carbohydrates strung together can make 1 sucrose molecule, that's table sugar. But you can build all sorts of other things from carbohydrate. So a plant first produces carbohydrate, and then in later stages it builds everything else that the plant is made out of. And then sooner or later, maybe you eat it, and then maybe, or maybe something turns some of those or something else eats it and turns some of those materials into protein. Certainly, your body builds proteins too. That's what photosynthesis is. That's exactly, it's a very, very specific thing that plants do. The world's plants do. They don't do anything else. They have layers after that, but the core operation that they do is they take 8 photons, 1 carbon dioxide, 2 waters, and they do something special with those, and afterwards they have carbohydrate, which has a lot more energy than before, than the carbon dioxide did. It has one kilogram of carbohydrate. It holds about 4,000 calories, and it also produces oxygen, and it produces water. So you start with 2 waters molecules and you end up with 1. Okay. So I want to just take a time out for a minute and point out that plants do the opposite of what animals do in a very specific sense. Plants breathe in carbon dioxide and they breathe out oxygen, and they produce carbohydrate. Okay, whereas animals, and also fires for that matter, breathe in oxygen and burnable material like carbohydrate, and they breathe out carbon dioxide. That this is the essential chemical difference between animals and plants. And it means that it's sort of like yin and yang. Okay, the plants produce the oxygen that we breathe, and we produce the carbon dioxide that they breathe. So that's what photosynthesis is. That's what plants are doing. Now, the process that I just described, the ingredients are just carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. But plants do need small amounts of other materials, of other elements to make, if they want to go beyond building carbohydrate, if they want to say make fat or protein or build their own body, the whole plant body, or like cellulose or lignin, which are two of the main building blocks that make a plant have its shape. They do need small amounts of other things. Okay, so the top three are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So if you're interested in fertilizing your ground, you'll often get bags which have the three numbers on them, telling the three numbers say how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is in the bag. Then there's the next three, which the plants don't need as much of, which are calcium, sulfur, and magnesium. And then there are another 8 elements called micronutrients, which the plants need very small amounts of, like copper. Those are the nutrients that plants need to grow, and these are essentially additives. You have almost all of the plant materials made out of carbohydrate, or things that come from carbohydrate. In other words, things originating in water and carbon dioxide. And then there are small amounts of these other elements, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And to get a feeling for how small these other additives, how small a percentage these other additives are, what you can do is you can think about what you put into a fire versus what you get out of a fire. Suppose you take a log and you burn it, and you burn it until you burn it well, and you burn it until there's nothing but ash and maybe some soot in the air. And then imagine collecting all the ash and the soot in the air, and you'd find that you might have a handful or two compared to the 5-kilo log that you burned. And that handful is basically all the nutrients that went into the log. That's the additives. A huge amount of the log's mass disappears while it's burning, and that's because most of the log was made out of water and carbon dioxide, and as it's burning it turns back into water and carbon dioxide. All fires produce water. There are some weird chemical fires, but almost all fires that we burn produce water and carbon dioxide. So there's not much in those additives, but it's important. But almost all of a plant's material comes from water and carbon dioxide. Now, roughly half of the plant is hydrogen and oxygen, and the other half, by weight, is roughly carbon. Okay. So roughly, in general, this is a good rule of thumb. You have 1 kilo of dry plant material. Around half of that will be carbon. And then you take that kilo of dry plant material, whatever it is, and it will produce 2 kilos of carbon dioxide, because you're adding, carbon dioxide doesn't just have carbon in it, it also has oxygen. So this is a rough rule of thumb. For most burnable materials, it works just as is. 1 kilo of plant material produces 2 kilos of carbon dioxide. But there are some variations. For instance, gasoline and anthracite. Anthracite is the highest quality coal. Produce for each kilo of those materials, you get 3 kilos of carbon dioxide. Whereas for lignite, which is the worst grade of coal, 1 kilo produces only 1.5 kilos of carbon dioxide. These numbers might lead you to think that it's better to burn lignite than anthracite or gasoline. Now it's the reverse, because the anthracite and gasoline hold a lot more energy. So if you're thinking about how much carbon dioxide you have to generate in order to get a certain amount of energy, there's really no advantage. I think the best is natural gas, but I'm not sure. So that's what a plant does, and what the materials are that it's made out of and that it produces. And now we come to how a plant does it. And here we come, this is why I went into 5 minutes discussing our ability to understand, or inability to understand, chemicals, even small chemicals, and let alone proteins and how they work. And just bear in mind that here, as I'm discussing how plants do their work, what they're doing is something more marvelous and complex than anything we've ever begun to dream of inventing. And that we have very limited insight into. We're newcomers to this, but we know the major outlines in lots of details. We've had armies working on this for 50 or 100 years. And we've been throwing all sorts of money at it, and at understanding biology and DNA and so on. So we do have some insight, but there's just oceans of complexity and of details and marvels that are still largely mysterious to us. But here are the 3 main steps in the process of harvesting light. So first, there's a particular group of proteins that is called photosystem 2. And what this group of proteins is first of all around 200 chlorophyll molecules. What is a chlorophyll? It's basically an antenna, just like an antenna that you might still see sprouting off of your car to catch a radio wave, or it could be like the antennas that are used to transmit cell phone signals, or in a Wi-Fi device. Something that can pick up energy, and in particular chlorophyll knows how to pick up sunlight energy. There are roughly 200 of these clustered around what's essentially a battery, and this battery, its name is the oxygen evolving complex. This is actually a relatively accessible name compared to many of the other names that come up. So the photosystem 2's job is to gather 4 photons using its many chlorophylls and focus them all on this battery. Okay, when it captures a photon, what that photon allows it to do is to pull 1 electron out of the battery, out of the oxygen evolving complex. So it pulls electrons 1 by 1 out of this complex until it has pulled out 4 electrons from this complex. And with each electron that gets pulled out, the complex's energy increases, steps up. So after 4 photons are received, 4 electrons have been removed, and there are 4 times as much, 4 units of energy in the complex. And then that complex has the possibility, once it has those 4 units of energy, it's able to do something important. It's able to take 2 water molecules, and split the hydrogens away from the oxygens. So it robs the oxygens from the waters. Water is two hydrogens and an oxygen, so two waters would be four hydrogens and two oxygens. It robs the waters, robs the hydrogens from the oxygens or vice versa, separates them all, and so the end result is that this oxygen evolving complex with the 4 units of energy produces 4 electrons, 4 hydrogen ions. An ion is what's left of an atom after you take away an electron, and 1 oxygen molecule. Now the oxygen molecule goes flying away into the atmosphere. This is the point where the plant breathes out oxygen. So the oxygen goes away, and what's left is 4 electrons, 4 hydrogens. And the electrons and hydrogens have a little bit of energy from the 4 photons that came in that they didn't have before. So photosystem 2's job, again, to recap, it takes in 4 photons, it takes in 2 waters, and it produces 4 electrons, 4 hydrogens, and those hydrogens and electrons are carrying some energy. So next we come to photosystem 2, which is another huge set of machinery, many proteins working together. And again, you have many chlorophylls capturing sunlight and all focusing them on a particular center. Okay. Many of these antennae waiting for photons to come in. And photosystem 2's job is to take the 4 electrons from photosystem 1 that it produced and add some energy to them. Why does it want to add energy to them? Because there's not enough energy in them after photosystem 2 to do whatever is needed next. Okay, so they need some extra energy. So what it does is it gathers 4 photons at a time and adds their energy to those 4 electrons. So they have boosted energy. Okay, and so now we have 4 electrons with boosted energy. We have 4 hydrogens, and that's photosystem 2 is done with its job now. And then there are a bunch of steps where the boosted electrons with the extra energy are turned into, that energy is moved into some energy transporter molecules. You'll have heard of one of them, ATP. The other one I hadn't heard of before. It's NAPH, or is it NADH? I'm not sure. Two energy transporter molecules, ATP and NADH. So once photosystem 2 is done and its aftermath is done, what we have left is some energy carrying molecules, ATP and NADH, and we have 4 hydrogens wandering around. So that's the second act of photosynthesis. And then there's the third act, which is, you may remember that carbohydrate needs a carbon. Carbohydrate's chemical formula is 1 carbon, 2 hydrogens, and an oxygen, so it needs to get carbon from somewhere. Where does it come from? It comes from carbon dioxide in the air. Okay, so the third act is capturing carbon dioxide and transferring the energy from those transporter molecules, ATP and NADH, onto the carbon dioxide and turning it into carbohydrate. So, and the centerpiece of this stage, and it's really the centerpiece of all of photosynthesis, this is a marvel among marvels, it's amazing, is called rubisco. It's a particular protein designed to capture carbon dioxide. It's a hard thing to do, and I'll get into why in the next episode. Capture carbon dioxide and process it to turn it into carbohydrate. So what rubisco does is it takes the 4 hydrogens that have been wandering around since step 1 of this, act 1 of this process. It takes 1 carbon dioxide from the air. It takes the energy that's being transported by the NATP and the NADPH, and it uses all of those ingredients to produce one carbohydrate and one water molecule. This is called fixing carbon in technical jargon. It just means you take the carbon from the carbon dioxide in the air and you turn it into carbohydrate. So there are these two prepping acts, photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. I think I might have messed this up a bit. The first act is photosystem 2, and weirdly, the way things have been named by the scientific community, the second act is called photosystem 1. Photosystem 2 harvested four photons and processed its split water, so it now you have the hydrogen atoms wandering around, plus 4 electrons. Photosystem 1 in the second act boosted the energy of the electrons, and then that energy, the energy in the boosted electrons was transferred to ATP and NADPH. And then in Act 3, since we now have the ingredients, the energy in the ATP and NADPH, and we have the hydrogens, and there's oxygen that the plant breathes in, finally Rubisco is able to do its work and produce carbohydrate. So those are the 3 acts. And now that we know the 3 acts, we can begin to talk about energy loss, which is the main point here, energy loss and water use. So the energy loss breaks down into 3 stages. Overall, there's a factor of 20, a little more than a factor of 20 actually, energy loss. Okay, so first, only about 40% of the incoming sunlight is accepted by photosystems 1 and 2. 60% of the sunlight is reflected or transmitted or turned into heat. It never, in other words, those antennae, the chlorophyll antennae and the batteries and so on that they're connected to, just reject 60% of the sunlight. This is a factor of 2.5, 2.5 energy loss. And at the end of this episode, I'll discuss briefly why these photosystems reject 60% of the light. They're very simple reasons, and how much it could be improved, and it'll never improve to better than a factor of 2. In other words, they could never accept more than 50% of the incoming light. They already accept 40% of it. Okay, and even then, it's not clear that they could really accept 50%. It's not clear that we could actually improve it. That's better. Okay, so first of all, a bunch of light is rejected before it even really enters the process of photosynthesis. 40% is accepted, so 2 out of 5 units of energy, 2 out of 5 calories are accepted into the chloroplast. And then there's another factor of 6 energy loss. Only 17% of that energy that actually enters into the plant cell, it ends up stored in carbohydrate. It's really hard for a plant. It's really a marvel. It's an act of genius for a plant to be able to turn carbon dioxide into carbohydrate, and I'll get into why in the next episode. It's really a technical marvel. We'd have a lot of and because it's such a difficult thing, it's a very complicated process. This thing that Rubisco does and all its helpers do of capturing the carbon dioxide and turning it into carbohydrate. So, and that's also why the fact that it's so difficult is also why during these steps, so much water gets used. The plant actually is sacrificing water in order to get carbon dioxide from the air, and it has to sacrifice an awful lot of water. Again, I'll come to this in the next episode. Um, and so overall, you can the energy loss is you only 17% and of the energy. This is plants in a lab. Only 17% of the energy coming in is uh, is uh, is stored in carbohydrate, and it turns out that there's a hard limit. There's no way to change this limit at all. There's no way that the efficiency could be better than at 32% efficiency. So already at 17, the best it could do would be 32%, and I'll say in a minute why it would never be better than 32%. But that means that the best you could improve this, even if you had a magically perfect plant and a magically fortuitous world, or with absolutely no difficulties for it, the best you could do is double the efficiency of this step. Okay, so um, um, now I'll tell you how you can know that the best you could get is 32% efficiency here. It's because the input for photosynthesis is 8 photons, and the output is 1 carbohydrate molecule. So all you do is you figure out how much energy is in those photons, and you figure out how much energy is in the carbohydrate, and is stored in 1 carbohydrate molecule. You compare them and you find that the energy in 1 carbohydrate molecule is 32%, about 1/3 of the energy in the original 8 photons. So those photons have at least, now it actually can be a little bit worse. These are red photons, and red photons have a little less energy than orange, and less again than green, and so on. So if they were say blue photons coming in, which have quite a bit more energy than red photons, and if you compared the energy of 8 blue photons to the energy in a carbohydrate, you'd find that you're actually storing less than 32% of the energy in the blue photons because they have more. Okay, all that extra energy in the blue photons just gets wasted. It gets turned into heat, and so um, that's a basic reason. So assuming that you have not the real sun, but you have a red sun that produces only red photons, so there's no energy wastage associated with orange or green or violet photons. Still, the best you could do would be 32%. So if you wanted to do better than 32% energy storage efficiency at this step, you'd have to either not produce carbohydrate and produce something else, like maybe hydrogen, something that nobody would be able to eat, nothing would be able to eat, or else you'd have to find some way to make photosynthesis work, or something like photosynthesis work with a different number of photons. Either way, you wouldn't be helping the plant along anymore. You'd be making such a basic revision to the plant that it wouldn't really be a plant anymore. It would be something of your own invention. It would be a complete replacement of a plant. So either you have real plants from the real world that harvest 8 photons and produce 1 carbohydrate, or else you have something of your own invention. It's really, everything about the plant would have to change. It wouldn't be a plant anymore. So, but even putting that aside, the fact is that we can't do it. We've been trying for 50 years to tinker with the genes, and I'll go into this in the next episode, and not the next episode, but the ones after that, of doing little improvements to plants, and even our tinkering almost never works out well. And then when you talk about a complete replacement of the core of the plant's machinery, it's like taking somebody who can't even do an oil change on their car and telling them to replace the engine. We can't do it. We're just novices. So can't get there. We'll never do better than 32%, which is only a factor of 2 better than the 17% that we get now. So there's one more energy loss. So far we have a 2.5 factor of 2.5 energy loss because 60% of the sunlight is rejected at an early stage. Then we have a factor of 6 loss while the plant is trying to take that sunlight energy and capture carbon dioxide and turn it into carbohydrate. And then lastly we have about somewhere just a little bit more than 33, a little bit more than 1/3 of the energy that gets turned into carbohydrate will be used to help the plant grow and live and do everything that it needs to do to stay alive, okay, and to flourish, hopefully. So plants have to live, otherwise they don't harvest energy. And so they need some percentage of the energy, and in our grains growing in labs, they harvest just a little bit more than 1/3 of the energy, and it's really impossible to do any better than that. So that's a factor of somewhere between 1.5 and 1.67 energy loss. So taking these three factors, 2.5 because sunlight is being rejected, another factor of 6 while turning carbon dioxide into carbohydrate, another factor of 1.5 or so for just for the plant to stay alive and to grow. Overall, this comes to just a little bit more than a total of factor of 20, a little bit more than 20. So I've broken down, I've told you the process that plants use to capture sunlight and carbon dioxide, produce carbohydrate. I've told you about the energy losses and how they break down, and I've told you how much they could possibly be improved. And overall, right now we have a factor of 20, a little bit more than 20 energy loss. The best we could do would be to maybe capture 50% of the sunlight instead of 40% of that, and then I'll get into that at the end of this episode. It's coming up very soon now. And then the other thing that we could do is we could, in a magical, perfect world, we could change the energy efficiency of capturing carbon dioxide from 17% to 32%, and overall the total energy gain would be around a factor of 2, and we'd in our perfect plant, in a perfect dream world, would capture 1 out of 10 sunlight calories. Okay, that's why the best is a factor of 2, best possible improvement, and how it would work. Almost all of it would have to come from improving how plants capture carbon dioxide, which is a really hard thing to do, and I'll come to that in the next episode. But before we wind up, you know, the business of capturing carbon dioxide is really a thing of beauty and of immense. It's amazing that plants can do it at all, and so that's why I'll be spending a whole episode on that. And that's also why I'm going to end this episode by wrapping up why plants lose energy, why they reject 60% of the incoming energy. That way, in the next episode, we can just concentrate on the carbon dioxide, how it gets turned into carbohydrate by the rubisco protein and its helpers. And also I'll be talking about water, why plants use so much water while they're doing it. But right now, I'll just wrap up with some words about the sunlight. And this comes down to the spectrum. Uh, you know that if you have a prism, it'll split light into many colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet are some standard names. Roy G. Biv. Okay, so those are the visible colors. But it will also, but also there are colors that are more red than red. They're they're so red that you can't see them, and those are called infrared. And we can feel infrared because it makes our skin warm. And then there are also colors that are more violet than violet, um, and uh, and we can't see those colors either. But uh, if we expose ourselves to ultraviolet light long enough, we'll get a sunburn. Um, so what's the difference between these different colors? It's that the photons that are red have less energy per photon than photons that are orange or blue or violet, and photons that are in the infrared part of the spectrum, they have even less energy than red photons that we can see. And photons that are ultraviolet, they have even more energy than the blue light that we can see. And the way that a plant will handle these different colors differently. Basically, the only colors that a plant can sunlight contains all these colors. It includes infrared, that's because it makes us feel warm. It includes visible light, that's why we can see with sunlight, and it also includes ultraviolet, which is why we get sunburned. Okay, and plants also receive all of these kinds of sunlight: infrared, visible, and ultraviolet, and they only, however, harvest the visible light. They don't harvest energy from the infrared, and they don't harvest energy from the ultraviolet. And about 50% of sunlight's energy comes in infrared and ultraviolet, so already 50% is rejected because the plants only harvest energy from the same colors that we see. And then in addition, they don't get quite all of the energy from the visible light. About 50% of sunlight energy is visible, and they only get 40%. So there's a bit of an energy loss there, and I'll explain why. So there are three energy losses to think of. One is they're losing infrared. Why are they doing that? And another one is they're losing ultraviolet. Why are they losing ultraviolet? And is there anything to do about it? No. Actually, the answer is no. And then they're losing a bit of the visible light energy. And is there anything to do about it? And again, the answer is no. But I'll go through all three of them. First of all, ultraviolet, the kind that gives us sunburns. Okay, why does ultraviolet give us sunburns? It's because the photons have more energy, and more energy than the chemicals in our bodies can cope with. So it's the chemicals in our bodies are made out of carbon and some additives, carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, and then a few additives. And they handle certain amounts of energy well, and are able to store those in oils and fats and carbohydrates and proteins. But they're sort of like a one size. Our chemicals in our bodies only handle specific units of energy, and if you try to put more energy in, it kind of overflows, and then our bodies don't know how to handle it. So what happens when an ultraviolet photon hits your skin is that it brings in more energy than the chemicals in your body can handle. Those extra bits of energy overflow and disrupt the chemicals in your skin, and eventually, if there are enough of them coming in, kill your skin cells. Okay. Now, as it happens, plants are made out of the same sorts of chemicals as we are. They're made out of carbohydrates, proteins, and all the same things that we are, and therefore plants can't handle ultraviolet just as we can't handle ultraviolet. In other words, plants get sunburn if you put them under ultraviolet light. So, what do they do about it? Of course, you don't want your plant that's out in the field all day to die of sunburn, and they don't want to do that either. So what they do is they manufacture their own sunscreen. So the sunscreen, just like sunscreen on our face or whatever, is designed to just make sure that the sunlight doesn't get into the cell and disrupt it and tear it apart. It stops the ultraviolet light. So, and they have their own sunscreen. The reason why they do that is because they don't want to die. Okay. In other words, if you have carbon-based life forms, plants or animals, you're never going to harvest ultraviolet light. You just can't. Carbon-based light forms cannot harvest ultraviolet light because it's destructive. The best they can do is screen it. That's why our plants just reject ultraviolet light completely. So that's one energy loss. What's left? There's the visible light. Why don't they get all of the visible light? And then why don't they harvest infrared light? Okay. Well, first I'll talk about the visible light. Okay. Why aren't they getting all of the energy from the visible light? And I already mentioned this earlier. It's the fact that blue photons have more energy than red photons, and when the photosynthesis systems inside of a chloroplast harvest light from photons, they really only need the light of a red photon. So if you have 8 red photons coming in, that's good enough, and the plant will go to work and produce its carbohydrate. If you have instead 8 blue photons coming in, which have almost twice as much as energy, that's good enough, and the plant will go ahead and produce its carbohydrate, and it won't produce an extra carbohydrate. It'll just produce one, and the extra energy in those 8 blue photons will just get wasted, turned into heat. So that's the essential reason why not all of visible light is turned into carbohydrate. I mean, it's because the plant treats blue photons just as if they were red photons. And that overall is the reason why, instead of harvesting all of the energy in visible light, which is about half of the energy in sunlight, 50% of sunlight energy is visible, instead the plant gets 40% of the sunlight energy. Okay, so one last energy loss, which is the infrared. Okay. Why do plants not harvest light from photons that are in the infrared? In other words, heat photons. And the reason is that it needs a certain amount of energy in order to get to do the water splitting and the other steps for energizing its electrons and so on. It needs, if you remember photosystem 2's job, that's the first act of photosynthesis, was to accept 4 photons and to use those 4 photons to store 4 units of energy in its battery so that later it could split water. And the unfortunate thing is that it needs, or maybe fortunate, is it needs exactly the amount of energy in a red photon, and photons with less energy than a red photon, in other words, the kind of photons that you can't see, infrared photons, they don't have enough energy to help it along. So that's why if you are in a lab and instead of giving the plants all red light, lots of red light, instead you give them lots of infrared light, your plants won't grow. It's because the infrared light, you just put them under infrared so you don't see anything with your own eyes. Well, the infrared photons do nothing for the plant because they just aren't big enough to get the ball rolling on the photosynthesis. So we can't improve on the ultraviolet because plants like us are vulnerable to ultraviolet light. We can't improve on the visible light because just the way that plants do their photosynthesis, they need exactly 8 photons, no more and no less, and they come in 4 to one photosynthesis system and 4 to the other photosystem, and they need exactly that amount of energy, and they don't need any more. So there's no use for the other energy. So we can't improve on that one either. Perhaps we could improve on the infrared, on harvesting from infrared, because we have found in the last 20 or so years, we have found some bacteria in the sea that have a different kind of chlorophyll in them. There are 2 kinds. One is called chlorophyll D and another one's called chlorophyll F. And these chlorophylls are able to absorb infrared light. And the plant, for some reason, is able to use the infrared light and go on with its photosynthesis. So ever since these were discovered, people have speculated that perhaps we could get plants growing on land to grow their own chlorophyll D and chlorophyll F, and therefore harvest infrared light. And that would give plants perhaps increase their harvest from 40% to 50%. Now, as it happens, we have found it very difficult to get plants to do that. I think we've gotten some plankton to do that, but as yet we still haven't managed to get plants to grow their own chlorophyll D or chlorophyll F. It's a hard thing to do. And then there's also a fly in the ointment. I've talked about lab experiments where you put in fact, in lab experiments, I've been talking about lab experiments with plants grown in sunlight, but actually they grow them not in sunlight because, as you know, plants throw away 60% of the sunlight energy. Instead, they grow them under red light. Okay. So that way they don't throw away any energy. At that level, and what's left is, in fact, 1 out of 10 calories of roughly of the red light energy is harvested instead of 1 out of 20 sunlight calories. Now, so you grow them under red light, you find that they harvest 1 out of 10 calories. But recently, some experiment, and you try growing the same plants under infrared, and you find that they harvest nothing and they die. Okay, so the same. Recently, some researchers have done an interesting experiment where they supplied in the lab a combination of colors. They supplied infrared light, which shouldn't supposedly do anything for the plant, and they harvested brighter colors, higher energy colors like green or violet. And what they found was that, at least in their lab with these particular plants, they found that if they were supplying, say, violet light to the plant and infrared light, then the plant was able to harvest energy from both kinds of light, both the infrared and the violet. So somehow the extra energy in the violet light made up for the missing energy in the red light. This was just in the last few years, so we'll see how it bears out and whether other researchers confirm it. But it would be, if their results are correct, it would mean that in the real world, in real fields, plants are actually harvesting infrared light anyway, and so so that already that would mean that in the field they're already getting a factor. They're harvesting 50% of the light, not the 40% that they do in a lab where there's only red light. And it would also mean that there's no room for improvement in this area. Okay, so that would mean that if it's true that if the scientific result is true that plants faced with a number of colors are able to take advantage of infrared light as long as there's blue light or green light to help them along, then that would mean that there's really nothing we can do for plants, not even by giving them chlorophyll D or chlorophyll F to help them harvest more energy than they do, reject less energy, less sunlight than they do. They're already doing the best that we could imagine because we can't help them with ultraviolet light. So what we could do, what's left that we could do, while we can't help them with, well, at most we could help them stop rejecting 60% and have them reject only 50%. And we can't do anything about the fact that plants need to grow themselves and keep themselves alive, so that's a factor of 1.5 energy loss there. The only thing that we can really do much about is the factor of 6 energy loss that is incurred when the rubisco protein and its helpers capture carbon dioxide and turn it into carbohydrate. And so that's the short of it. Really the only place that we could look for to improve the internals of a plant is this. So as I was saying, there's really no possibility of the biggest improvement you could get would be a factor of 2, and that would be if you increased the efficiency of harvesting carbon dioxide from the air. And there's a doubtful and improvement from 40% to 50%. In other words, a 1.25 times improvement. If you were to do something about the chlorophyll, and even that is doubtful, and that's about it. So in the next episode I'll be talking about how plants go about capturing carbon dioxide. It's a marvel, and then in the following episodes I'll be talking about different scientific ideas about what we could do with genetic engineering or maybe breeding to improve the capture of carbon dioxide. Overall, this is the conclusion will be that we're not likely to get even that factor of 2, and really the best way of improving our plants' harvest is by improving the land that they grow on, which, as you recall, that's a factor of 5 loss difference between the world's best land and the world's average land. So that winds it up for this episode. Come back next time to wind up the plant harvest, and then we'll be talking about improvements on the plant's harvest, and in a few episodes we'll be finally have a last word on how much we could improve the plant's harvest and how much we could possibly get from plants if we were to work real hard. Okay, well, thank you for that, and keep coming back.